All right. Are we live? We ready to go? Okay, we're just gonna wait a minute or two. Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Stojkovic here with SF City. As we were just joking, this is my remote office setup. I have Ben Rosenfield here from the city. Let's just wait a minute or two for everyone to come in. Thank you for giving us your lunch. All right, I can see everyone starting to trickle in. We'll get started in just 1 minute. Okay. All right, what do you think, Ben? You want to get started? Oh, we got you muted.
Whenever you're ready.
Awesome. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jen, as I said, and we are SF City. This is our first webinar that we're hosting in a new series where we're going to be talking about the impacts that the COVID-19 pandemic has on the city of San Francisco. We're really excited today to kick it off with our city controller, Ben Rosenfield, who's going to be here to do a little bit of a presentation about the state of affairs, as well as have a chance for you to participate as the audience, talking a little bit about what the future of San Francisco's budget looks like. I have a couple quick housekeeping notes that I'm going to do. So first off, if everyone sees at the bottom there, there's a little Q&A button. So that Q&A is going to be live throughout today's webinar. So if you have any questions for Ben that you would like to ask as we're doing the conversation today, please stick them in the Q&A. We do have some time at the end of today's conversation to go through some of your questions. We'll get to as many of them as we can. This webinar is being recorded. We're also live streaming on Facebook right now. So if you missed something, such as many of the details that I think we're gonna cover today, you can always share it and rewatch later. We will also be sharing on social media. So if you have any thoughts on today's discussion, please use the hashtag #TheCovid19Effect and tag SF City on Twitter. And that's us right there. I'm going to do a real quick poll of the room before we get started. This is something I love to do in our live events. I love asking where everyone came from and how they heard about this event and what industry they're in, but I can't do hand raising. So we're going to do a quick poll. And there you go. We'd love to hear where you come from and what industry you work in. I'm just going to give that a second to tabulate. Okay, so unsurprisingly, we have a lot of people coming from the tech industry today. And this just gives us a little bit of background to know who we're talking to. It makes it a lot easier for Ben and I to frame the conversation today. Cool. Okay, so today's split is about 50% tech, 30% nonprofit, and then the remaining percent is city and marketing. We got some marketing folks in the room. So welcome everyone. That tends to be the split of all these SF City events. We always have a good chunk of tech people as well as nonprofit folks. That's a good segue into what is SF City. So we are San Francisco's tech trade association, which means that we were founded and we are funded by members here in San Francisco, consisting of some of the largest as well as fastest growing startups in the city. As a member-based coalition, we work with the industry, we work with policymakers here in the city, and we work with the broader San Francisco community to collaborate on solving local issues, such as things like the city budget and how we can work together. Our last point that I will make before turning it over to Ben is we are actually providing San Francisco's COVID-19 tech resources. So if you want to check out what our membership is doing right now and what resources might be available to you as a nonprofit or a small business, please go to the sfcity.org webpage and you can follow all of our COVID-19 updates. We'll also be sharing resources right here in the chat. Okay, I think that about sums it up. Mr. Rosenfield, I am going to turn it over to you to introduce yourself as well as kick off our presentation on today's city budget.
Okay, thank you for having me, Jen, and it's good to see everyone virtually here today. I'm Ben Rosenfield. I work as the city controller. I've been doing this for a while now. This is my 12th year in this job. And in this role, I effectively serve as a financial advisor to both the mayor and the board on budget and other issues. I manage a lot of the city's financial functions and enjoy coming to sessions like this one to share information about financial challenges that we face as a city, and we certainly have them at the moment. I thought I would start off with a brief run through, maybe about 15 minutes of some of our current thinking and things we're watching in the San Francisco economy, and then from there roll through a few slides on city budget impacts and our early thinking about how to approach this challenge.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
Okay.
All right, we're going to launch a slide deck here in a moment.
Okay, can you see that, Jen?
I can see it. We're good.
Okay. Yeah, I thought I would start, and I know a number of the folks on this call obviously know this, but just how significant the impact of this public health emergency and the shelter-in-place orders that have been put in place all over California and here in San Francisco are on our local economy. This is a summary slide with a lot of information on it, just about the number of businesses in the city that are directly impacted or partially impacted by shelter-in-place, meaning they either have to close fully or partially as a result of this event. It's a huge number of businesses in the city. 14,000 is our estimate of the number of businesses affected by shelter-in-place directly or indirectly, or partially. They employ 167,000 San Franciscans. That's almost 25% of our local private employment base. Those businesses earn about $3 billion a month in revenue, and they pay almost $1 billion in monthly pay to their salaries and pay to their employees. So just a very large part of the San Francisco economy impacted here immediately. We've seen that correspond very quickly into really tremendous increases in unemployment here in California through the month of March, even prior to shelter in place, and then certainly after it. We don't yet have April information, but we will shortly. But in California, a month that started, March, that started with unemployment under 4%, ended with unemployment over 10%. Just an unbelievable month economically here in the state. And you can see that here. And we do expect that unemployment rate to rise through the month of April, both in California, in the Bay Area, and then here in San Francisco. We've obviously been, a lot of our job here is to project the impacts economically and then financially on how this is going to play out looking ahead. And it's a moment of tremendous uncertainty, not only from a health perspective, but an economic and financial one as well. Just as a quick snapshot of just how rapidly the world has changed here, I thought I would walk through quickly Moody's forecasts of US GDP over the last couple months and how rapidly they've changed. This is their January forecast of GDP in 2020 in the US, and the quarterly growth rates that you'd see, kind of steady growth through the full fiscal year, or through the full calendar year. By March, and this is on March 23rd, they issued a significant downward revision. And this came as we started to see the impacts of COVID on the West Coast, in particular in the Northeast or Northwest. And you can see that they projected the first negative quarter that the US would see in really the last 10 years almost. And you can see that significant negative 5% GDP quarter in the quarter that we're now in, and then the beginning of a slower recovery bouncing out of it through the remainder of 2020. Just 4 days later, they issued another update to their forecast. And this was after shelter in place was imposed here in California and a lot of the places on the West Coast. You can see that significant downward revision. And this is Moody's current forecast, or most recent forecast. Almost a 20% contraction in US GDP in the second quarter, and then the beginning of a recovery after that. They prepared a couple of scenarios, kind of a more optimistic and less optimistic scenario. In the more optimistic scenario, the US wouldn't get back to the level of employment we saw in January until 2022. In a more pessimistic view, not until 2025. So potentially the beginnings of a deep and long recession. If we look at kind of what blue chip forecasters are telling us at the moment for the US, and these are US numbers again, this kind of gives you a sense of, among that group of economists, what's the average of their thinking at the moment. You can see here that there's a consensus -4% US GDP for the entirety of 2020. You can see here that they're expecting inflation to flatten significantly to under 1% in 2020, and that average over the course of this year, US unemployment would rise to 8.8%. And this slide is also showing you the top 10 and bottom 10 among that blue chip forecasters. But this gives you a sense of what the economic community is thinking 2020 might look like, and then the beginnings of what 2021 might look like. And I should say there's a lot of uncertainty in the short term. There's even more once you get out to the end of 2020 into 2021, given uncertainty about how the health emergency will continue to play out. If you take that forecast from the blue chip indicators and overlay it with the Great Recession, this is just what it looks like. It's if you've ever you've heard talks of V-shaped recessions, that looks like a V there in orange, and that's really the consensus among the blue chip forecasters at the moment. A very steep decline followed by a relatively quick snapback. So that a couple of years out, you would be back to your pre-recession levels. And you can see that that's a much sharper but faster recovery than the Great Recession after. For our city purposes, we're basically using currently a couple of different scenarios. A more limited impact scenario. This is one where the impacts will be felt sharply, but for a relatively short period of time, and then you'll begin to see a quick recovery in late 2020. So that's a more optimistic scenario. We're also using, though, because of the level of uncertainty, an extended impact scenario. In that scenario, we see severe current losses. They extend for maybe 6 months, and then we see a slower recovery that goes through 2021 and beyond. So the revenue numbers I'm going to talk to and the city budget impacts really hinging around these two scenarios. Importantly, neither of these is a worst case scenario. It is very possible that the extended scenarios we're looking at here, we will see a slower economic reopening in response to the health crisis than what we're projecting here. There is a possibility that in the US, like other places are experiencing around the world, we will have periodic outbreaks in the future, hopefully of a lesser magnitude, that will lead to cycling through restrictions, opening, reclosing partially. And you may see major cascading impacts that will ripple through other industries in the economy as a whole that would cause things to be worse, even in the extended scenario we're looking at here. So I know when you throw two scenarios out, people often assume that that's the best and worst case scenario. That's not the case here. There are scenarios that would be worse than the extended impact scenario that I'm going to walk through. In terms of how the city feels this, we're feeling some impacts almost immediately in the current fiscal year. We're going to see some impacts that begin to hit us next fiscal year, and then we've got some other things. So in the current year, we've seen a couple of tax revenue sources for the city just kind of vaporize almost immediately. Hotel tax is an obvious example. We've been at about 80 to 85% occupancy with very high room rates in San Francisco for the last many years. Occupancy rates here in the city are under 5%, and that's for the hotels that are still open. Many have closed. So with that means that we've seen almost $100 million in losses in hotel tax in the quarter that we're in. So just in 3 months, we expect to lose about $100 million in hotel tax, sales tax, parking tax, transfer tax, other ones that are paid monthly and are sensitive to the parts of the economy that have suffered these tremendous losses at the moment. We're going to feel all of those losses in the current year. The mayor and the board are also implementing a number of deferrals of taxes and fees. So it's not eliminating the tax or the fee, but rather saying, we understand you're in hard times, pay us later. So that's going to drive revenues down in the current fiscal year for the city. And then we'll see that revenue show up next fiscal year, but it will aggravate the current year loss. The bigger losses we're going to see, though, are not going to be felt in the current year, but next year. And that's because both property tax and business taxes, which are our two largest revenue sources, are really paid to the city on a cycle where losses being felt by businesses right now won't be felt in their property and business tax payments until next fiscal year. So we're going to see these current year losses, and then we're going to see our two largest revenues start to decline next year. I will also say that the city financial impacts coming from this event are also related to the cost of responding to the event itself. We're obviously dealing with a recession at this point, and the losses of revenues that come with that, but we are also dealing with the cost of responding to the emergency, health and otherwise, and that's very profound at this current moment. And there will be future costs, I think, even after this event ends, for the city to manage this new public health world we live in beyond that. So a number of different impacts financially. Revenue losses by fiscal year, this kind of shows you those limited and extended duration scenarios. You can see that the problem really, we have a very significant current year revenue loss, but it gets worse next year given property and business tax. And then you can see that we expect financial losses, even in a more limited scenario, to extend out into 21, 22. When we layer those revenue losses, which come to are significant numbers, on top of our previous projections of how the city's operating budget looks, we're left with about a $1.1 billion to $1.7 billion problem over the next 27 months. So that's the last 3 months of this year, and then the next 2 fiscal years, which are the budgets that the mayor and the board are required to balance in the next several months. It's a huge hole. So what are the first steps to closing the gap? We're certainly hopeful that federal assistance are going to help to cover some of our costs here. The CARES Act, the federal stimulus bill that has been adopted, did include money for local governments. It included money for hospitals. It included money for transit systems and others that will cover many of the event-related costs. We're obviously in an emergency. FEMA will be reimbursing the city for certain costs. Importantly, though, for the general fund at the moment, none of these federal sources, at least thus far, are available to offset revenue losses. They're going to help us cover the incremental costs of responding, but they're not going to help us close these revenue losses that we're going to feel. But they will help. The city's reserves are in much better condition than they've been in the last couple of fiscal years. So we have about $590 million in our rainy day reserves, for example, that will help offset that $1.1 to $1.7 billion problem. The city has done a good job of spending more money on capital and one-time programs during better times. Those programs will shrink, and that will provide some relief. But unfortunately, these 3 first steps are only going to soften the blow. There's no scenario that I can see where they fully cover the problem. And so harder choices are going to remain for the mayor and the board in the months ahead. We have delayed the city's budget process, which we have never done. But these are kind of unprecedented times where this health and financial calamity arrived at the exact moment when we were literally on the verge of proposing budgets. So the ground has shifted. So the mayor has shifted the budget calendar back. So in May, we're going to be updating our projections. All the numbers I just shared with you are from the end of March. So we're working on an updated projections with a bit more information. And then the mayor is going to propose a rebalancing plan for the current fiscal year, that first piece of the problem in May. There will be a preliminary kind of placeholder budget for the first 3 months of next fiscal year adopted by the Board of Supervisors. And then really the hardest work here will be between May and August, the mayor's office and departments working to propose a balanced budget for the next 2 fiscal years. And the mayor, under the revised budget calendar, will submit that budget to the board on August 1st. And then the board will take up the budget in August and September, and then adopt a final budget for the city about a quarter into the fiscal year. So by October 1st. You know, my experience from past cycles, and this one is unlike any I've been through, should lead us to indicate to believe, though, that the budget process won't end with the budget being adopted. That this is going to be a dynamic moment. Revenue projections are going to change. Trends will need to be monitored, and I would expect that over the next couple of years, we're going to be constantly readjusting spending plans for the government in light of new information. So that was a whirlwind tour, and I'll slow down there. Hand it back to you, Jen.
Wow, that was a lot. I have a really quick question that just kind of popped up. How do our reserves compare to other cities?
It's a good question. You know, our experience in the dot-com bust and in the Great Recession in the late 2000s was that the city really had inadequate reserves to take even the edge off of a recession. And so in 2010, the voters adopted a charter rule that changed a bunch of things about how the city approaches its finances. And from that, we put new reserve policies in place. And so our reserves are now, for the big 20 US cities, we're on the positive side of that range, probably in the best 25%. And that's been one of the reasons the city has been upgraded to AAA for the first time in about 40 years by rating agencies during this period. So our reserves are in relatively good shape, and certainly better than the last 2 recessions.
So what does AAA mean for those that are not familiar?
Oh, sure. So we participate in debt markets. We borrow money from investors to fund infrastructure. Rating agencies provide kind of a grading of the city's creditworthiness as part of that process. So Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and Fitch are the 3 big rating agencies. AAA is on their scale. AAA is the kind of the gold standard. It's the highest rating, and we're now at the highest rating level with two of the 3 rating agencies.
And what other cities would be kind of in a similar position to us on the high end with the AAA, and then who's kind of in the other end? Just for some context.
You know, a lot of the West Coast cities are actually in that kind of AAA category. So Seattle, for example, is a AAA city. Boston is a AAA city. San Francisco. The lower edge of ratings, unfortunately, my hometown of Chicago has been you know, kind of at the lower edge of things for a number of years now, given problems they've had. Philadelphia is relatively low.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, well that was my own personal interest. We have a couple other questions to get to. So we started the year with a projected shortfall already in the budget. So for those that aren't familiar, I think we were projected about 420. No pun with that, by the way, $420 million budget shortfall at the beginning of this year. So how did we start off the year with a budget shortfall already?
Yeah, so yeah, that's that January projection, 420 million. I think one thing that's helpful there is to remember that that's a 2-year number. Okay. And it's on a $6 billion annual budget. So it's about $200 million a year on a $6 billion budget. So kind of a modest difference. It basically came from our expectation that revenues were going to slow, that we were in the later innings of this recovery. Obviously, we were not projecting recessions, and we were certainly not projecting this, but we expected revenues to slow while a lot of the city's fixed costs continue to rise, and at a faster pace. Employee wages, employee benefits, being 2 notable ones, but a lot of kind of service and cost pressures on the city budget. kind of pushing ahead of slowing revenue growth.
Okay. So taking it back to earlier, you were talking about how the voters changed the way that we were participating in reserves as a city, and what we were collecting as a city. That started a little while ago when we had the Great Recession and the dot-com bust and all of that. So what can we take from those experiences that we've learned and apply here? Or is this just an unprecedented, totally V-shaped recession where it's going to act like a completely different beast?
Yeah, we certainly learned things from the last two recessions that led us to some of the preparatory steps that leave us where we are here today. Better reserves, much more investment during better times on kind of more flexible spending, things like infrastructure and capital that are easier to kind of shrink when times are worse. The city now prepares a 2-year budget, which kind of limits the tendency for people to use one-time tricks to get through problems and instead make kind of structural changes. So I think all of that will serve us well looking through this cycle. I will say that this one I think will feel very different than the last couple in ways that I just don't know yet, and I don't think any of us do. It's going to be this story, I think, of managing through intense uncertainty here, not just in our own personal lives. You know, when does the shelter in place ends? How does it end? How does it phase out? What does the future of the virus hold over the next year to year and a half? All of that kind of uncertainty for us as individuals and as people operating businesses, all of that's going to kind of dramatically drive what the future of the city's tax revenues look like. It's going to drive how the city needs to reorient our services to respond to kind of a future health risk and management of this in the future. And a lot of that is just unknown. And so I think that's going to be the hardest thing about this cycle is just, I don't know what the world will look like in 2 months, let alone in 24 months. And so planning budgets in this period is, I think, just going to take a remarkable amount of resiliency and a remarkable amount of flexibility to work through, more so than we saw in the dot-com bust or in the Great Recession.
Well, yeah, absolutely. The fundamental changing of how society functions. And this one that's coming up a lot and actually perfectly kind of fits into a budget question is things like SFMTA, things like public transit in general. Obviously, SFMTA, SFO, and the port are funded through our budget. So that having enterprise departments probably changes our budget a little bit. And if they are going to be seeing less ridership, perhaps because of physical distancing, people cannot be as compact, how do you see that affecting what the budget could look like in revenue projections?
Yeah, I should say the numbers I was talking through were basically half of the city's budget, the general fund side. They're really the other half, the enterprise funds that make up the other $6 billion. There are significant impacts happening there too, above and beyond the ones I just talked about. The airport is a big one. The port is another that's going to feel very significant losses. And then the MTA, the transit here in San Francisco and around the country is just getting financially crushed by this. And I think you're right. What does the future of public transit look like, at least for the next couple of years coming out of this? The MTA's revenue losses in the current year are going to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars just for a quarter. How do they sustain service going forward? And we know we need transit service to serve, even in a moment like this, to get essential workers around to hospitals and to essential businesses and others, just to keep society functioning. So I think there are going to be a lot of big questions like that about a number of different governmental services here in San Francisco and elsewhere. And I don't have the answer yet, or don't know the answer.
How does, just to add to that question, how does our transit system, in terms of how we gather our revenue and how it's funded, are we heavily reliant upon, clipper cards and things like that?
We're actually, because our transit agency here in San Francisco is consolidated in a way that not many are, it means that they've got a more diverse revenue base than most transit agencies will. Unfortunately, most of that revenue base is suffering losses though on multiple sides. So
Yeah.
we're probably less dependent on fare revenue than some of our peers are in other cities. But the MTA is reliant on parking fines and parking meters, for example.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of that revenue generated at the moment. And then they also get a percentage of the general fund. And so those are kind of three of their big colors of money. And during normal times, if one was falling, you might see strength in the other two, or at least stability. Unfortunately, at the moment, they're all falling. And so that creates kind of a perfect financial storm for the MTA.
I actually had a conversation yesterday talking about micromobility solutions and how those could actually represent for the future an interesting partnership, because things like scooters and bikes, especially in a West Coast city where we have the weather that accommodates it, those would fall into the physical distancing requirements that we'll likely begin to see.
I think you'll be having a lot of conversations like that with a lot of different city services. What does the new model look like for the next year, 2 years, and then what are the implications beyond that?
Yeah. So let's turn to some maybe good news. Is there anything that surprised you about the COVID-19 effect on the economy? Things that you've seen so far? Any good stuff? Before we turn it over to the audience, come on, we got to get some good stuff in.
Okay, I've got to look for one good thing or something good in this.
We're AAA. That's good.
We're AAA. We're AAA rated. We were that without the COVID crisis. So, I guess you see some bright spots economically. It's vastly outweighed by the negative, but you do see some health in some neighborhood grocers and neighborhood serving businesses that appear to be doing a bit better than they were before, which makes sense given that we're working in our neighborhoods now and more reliant on our corner store than we were a month ago. So you see kind of little dots of positives across the business community. I mean, they're small dots compared to everything else. So I mean, I think that's the closest I can do to good news at the moment, fortunately.
Okay. And before I turn it over to some audience questions, as SF City, I gotta ask this. We have a lot of dedicated taxes in this city.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious how you see that revenue kind of playing into what the budget could look like and how the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting that.
It's an interesting question. Different taxes are going to be impacted in different ways at the moment, given what we're seeing. By far, the biggest tax losses in the part of the economy that we're most sensitive at the moment to is the hospitality industry. So there have been a number of new additional taxes added in recent years, but for many years we've had this very significant hotel tax and business taxes on the hospitality industry as a whole. That's the most profound financial impact we're feeling at the moment, and that's reflective of larger damage that's occurring in the hospitality industry. Those really haven't been the subject of the newer taxes that have been put in place, most of which are on the most notable ones in recent years are on office and rent, and then on some of the largest employers here in San Francisco, some of which are no doubt feeling very significant pain at the moment. But others are doing, while not as well as they were in January, are still doing comparatively well against that hospitality sector and service sectors in the city.
Yeah, I was actually on a call recently, and they said that they're expecting between 8 to 15% commercial rent drop next year.
Mm-hmm.
And so and the taxes are tied to that. Some of the ones that have been passed.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, certainly. I mean, there's a lot of cases here where I think it's interesting to think about what were trends coming into this health crisis that pre-existed, where this is simply accelerated. And I think impacts that we were seeing and potentially made permanent impacts we were seeing in retail, for example, for many years now. I think this is likely accelerated and reset kind of what the retail market, bricks and mortar retail looks like going forward to a point. I think the same is probably true of office use. longer term trends towards telecommuting, kind of reducing our need for physical footprint in office buildings. I think that's obviously been being tested right now with mass telecommuting. And I think part of that will be a continuing trend in the office markets going ahead. And that'll affect rents and it'll affect taxes coming from that part of the business community.
Hey, we got that congestion pricing study coming up. Perhaps the work from home is the solution we're looking for. The streets are looking pretty good these days. Okay. And then lastly, is there any recession-proof taxes or taxes that we have in the city that are less volatile?
Yeah, it's there's no tax that's recession-proof, but one of the things that's tended to work well for the cities over time has been that as a combined city and a county, we have a pretty diverse tax base. And so while you have an impact on one part of the economy, and part of your tax base pushes down, you've got other parts of the tax base that hold up. That certainly carried us well through the last recession, where cities that are heavily reliant on property tax really felt that last recession very acutely because it was a property related recession. Our other taxes held us up. Here we probably have the opposite. Property taxes will probably help us in this environment, but those more sensitive hospitality related and business related taxes are going to get hit. So nothing's perfect, but the diversity of our revenues tend to serve us well over time.
Okay, so let's get to some of the questions because I can see we've got a queue that's piling up here. I'll start with Matt's questions first. What is the plan for developing a citywide approach to recovery and how will that affect the budget? Whatever you know so far. Obviously, we're in flux right now, of course.
Yeah, there's the president of the Board of Supervisors, Norman Yee, and Mayor Breed have convened a recovery task force that's actually going to be meeting starting later this week. It's chaired by Treasurer Jose Cisneros, Assessor Carmen Chu, Rodney Fong, the CEO of the Chamber of Commerce, and Rudy Gonzalez, who's the president of the San Francisco Labor Council. And I think that's a set of questions that's been put to that group. And they've convened a really pretty broad set, I believe, of business, nonprofit, labor, and others to kind of grapple with a lot of those questions. And so we shall see what that looks like. There's obviously a lot will go into economic recovery from this, both in the short term and the mid and long term. And I think the kind of the pace of the health recovery and the pace of the economic recovery will drive the health of the city's budget and of our finances. So I'm going to be participating in that process. I encourage other people to too. It's critically important. I don't think there'll be any easy answers coming from that. Starting again with the kind of uncertainty regarding what the health recovery looks like from this, the public health recovery that looks like coming from this. We kind of need to know more about what that looks like before we can begin talking about how to turn on the economy in different ways and support workers that are impacted in different ways and at what pace. So that's the primary effort that's been kicked off.
Okay. Here's an anonymous question that we received. What is the COVID-19 impact on startups in the cities, as well as the VC community? Are we still seeing VCs invest, if you're privy to this, of course, and what impact could we see on deal flow?
It's a good question. Ted Ian, who's our chief economist, would know the exact answer to that question. I have not seen any new information in the last month on VC investment in the city or startup activity. If past recessions are any guide, the beginning of sessions usually correspond with a very sharp reduction in VC investment and startup formation. Yeah. It's almost always immediate. And so I would be very surprised if we don't see that same trend play out here. As cash gets tighter, investments of all types go away very quickly. Unfortunately, I think that may well be the immediate future we face for startups in the city as well.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say it'll be an investor's market. Mm-hmm. Would you recommend a rebalance between the GRT and the payroll tax? And if you don't mind, just quickly explain to the audience what the GRT and payroll tax are.
Sure. So the city for many years had a payroll tax. That was the primary way we taxed business activity in the city. We were kind of alone in that in the U.S., at least among major cities. So again, coming out of that last recession, the city shifted to phase in a gross receipts tax. So rather than tax someone's cost of production, their payroll, it shifted to kind of the top line, how much revenue they're bringing in. That was phased in, given the way that voter measure was implemented, so that we didn't punch a hole in the city's budget because we were estimating. We found ourselves at the end of that legislated phase in and phase out period, not quite fully phasing away the payroll tax. So right now we have about 75% of our business taxes come from gross receipts, and about 25% come from payroll. We were working on a project actually before all this started to kind of rebalance our business tax again here in the city, along with many of the people on the call. That's on pause now, obviously, given this work. But yes, I think there is a better way to tax business activity in the city. I think we're kind of stuck at an accidental moment at the moment. We didn't intend to have taxes on both payroll and gross receipts. Our intent was to shift to gross receipts, which, given the tools we have here in California, feels to me like the kind of the most targeted and best way to tax business activity at a local level. So I would, at some point, I would like to see that phase out completed. And then there's a lot of impacts between industries in the way we set up the initial gross receipts tax that will need to get revisited as well. And I'm, maybe for 2022, which is the next election we have, we'll be in a place to kind of come back to that debate and figure out a better way.
Yeah, that's, I mean, we sat in your office a few months back, just kicking that off. And, for those of you that are unaware, on the webinar, if we put it on by ballot, that means that we have to change it by ballot. And so this will be something that you will end up seeing. It was originally going to be on the November 2020 ballot we were aiming for, but as Ben said, probably a 2022 ballot now. So this question I've gotten in a couple iterations, so I'm going to condense her down. San Francisco has a really big budget. That's the plain way to say it. It's a lot bigger than other comparable cities. Why is San Francisco's budget, even removing the enterprise aside, why is our per citizen spending so much higher than other cities?
Yeah, I mean, it starts with the uniquely consolidated nature of the city. We're a city and a county, and then the only one in California and one of only a few in the US. So we have both county functions like public health and human services and welfare, jails, and then we have city functions, police, fire, recreation. So those are put together. And then we also have other functions that are consolidated into the city government that in a lot of other places are completely standalone, like transit, like a transit system, or an airport, or a port, or a utility that serves San Francisco and the greater Bay Area with water service. So some of it is that uniquely consolidated, and I think that's the biggest single one. The other truth, frankly, though, is that we, even isolating that out, if we compare ourselves to, say, a Philadelphia or a Denver, or Honolulu, which are other consolidated governments, we have a very wealthy tax base here in the city. There's a lot of value here in the city that leads to a well-funded government. And we've also have remarkably high wages here in the Bay Area across all sectors, and that means that government employees are paid more than they are in other places, just as a fact of being a market participant here in the Bay Area. And then we've made a set of choices over time that lead to kind of fairly rich services in a couple of different areas of the city's budget, I think, as conscious choices. It's a well-funded government. We provide a very high level of investment in public health here in the city versus most of our peers. The same is true of fire service and emergency response service. And the same is true of kind of our local choices about human support and welfare. So it's a complicated question, but I think that's the thumbnail sketch of the answer from my perspective.
Good answer. I dig it. Okay. So Justin is asking, and I know we kind of covered the startup question, but any other trends or any speculation you could make about how this is going to affect the tech industry overall?
I'd be interested in hearing from the group. Frankly, you'll know better than I and have more precise and informed opinions of what this means. As we talked about, I do think the down economic cycles usually lead to lower investment in newer companies. I'm somewhat heartened that our technology sector here in the city, though, is much more mature than it was prior to either of the two prior recessions. And so this certainly isn't the dot-com bust where we have thousands and thousands of very small and very few mature technology companies that will weather this. And we certainly do now. We have companies that are now among the largest in the city that I'm hopeful will perform well through this and will continue to kind of drive a lot of economic activity, not just in the city as a whole, but in that ecosystem of companies that operate around them. The Googles and the Salesforces and many others, some of whom are on the call. So I hope it feels different than the last couple have felt for the tech sector.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if, we've had a lot of our members talk about the telecommuting work from home situation that's been going on at their companies. And quite frankly, we're hearing a lot of positive things. And one thing that we've been kind of curious about is, is this the de-urbanization of the economy and of tech, right? If you can do your job just as well from your hometown over in, Minnesota or something like that, it's a lot cheaper than San Francisco.
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of really fundamental questions about what land use looks like and how people work and how they live and how government services need to operate that, at least for the next few years, are going to be really challenged by this in a way that I can't see all the way through those right now, other than how they're profound, right? And telecommuting is obviously one of those.
How's telecommuting been for the city, by the way?
Better for some of us than others, probably. You've got a huge part of the city's workforce that cannot do their work remotely. If you go through the biggest city occupations, they are police, fire, their muni operations, it's running 2 hospitals, it's running neighborhood health clinics, it's operating the airport and operating the port. If you run down, it's operating wastewater treatment plants and water service, and none of that can be done remotely. And so the challenges of this on that workforce and on the city are really profound. We have a lot of city workers that are not telecommuting right now and are continuing to do their jobs in hard times. For those of us that can, and me and my shop are largely in that group, I find parts of it work and parts of it are harder. But I think just like for the private sector, for those of us, those parts of government that can, we're probably going to come out of this with kind of an expanded use of telecommuting for a lot of white collar office jobs in the city too.
Yeah, we had the CIO was on the chief information officer for the city about a week ago, and she said that one of the silver linings of the pandemic has been switching to virtual. There's been a lot more people participating in public meetings.
Huh.
So increased democracy, that could certainly be one silver lining.
Always a good thing.
Awesome. Okay, so I got a few more questions coming through here. All right, well, here's an easy one. How healthy is the city's pension fund given the current market conditions?
Not as healthy as someone like me would like it, but healthier than most. Coming into this, we were at about a 90% funded ratio, meaning the amount of money on hand plus expected future returns on it equaled about 90% of future costs. So that 90% is a lot better than most other public pension plans. I think California, I believe CalPERS is in the high 60s, for example.
Okay.
So we're in better shape than most, but that doesn't mean that we won't feel impacts coming through this. The pension fund will suffer losses. That'll mean the city's contributions to support pensions will rise. That won't happen right away. It'll happen about 18 months from now. But so we're doing better than most, but I think we will see another spike in pension costs coming in the next year to 2 years.
Fair. Another quick one. Are we going to be using our reserves?
It's what they're here for. We advocated strongly to save more money in better times, and we were not doing that as a function of trying to just hoard money. It's to let the government continue to provide key public services to the extent we can when times are worse and demands on public services get more. So I would expect our reserves will get spent over the next 2 to 3 years as we're weathering this. So yes, they will get spent. It's what they're supposed to do. It's what we're supposed to do with them in moments like this, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're really fortunate as a city to have them.
Yes.
All right, a few more questions. Do you see opportunity, and this is from Lainey, do you see opportunity for greater collaboration across city departments? If so, where?
Yes, always.
Good answer.
It's one of the interesting things about the way the city organizes during emergencies is that kind of the normal org chart gets thrown out and you reorganize into kind of an emergency management structure. So you've got 500 people at the Moscone Center working on the city's emergency daily response that are normally, and they're all organized into a single org chart, working together. And that's not the way the city is normally organized. But you do see people from multiple departments that normally aren't working together on an issue, troubleshooting issues together. Department leadership is reporting differently. And some positive things have obviously come from that. It allows us to move quickly. And there's a lot of people doing really good work there. And so I think there are probably lessons coming and relationships that come out of how the city is working right now that'll work in the post-emergency world as well.
That's interesting. You must be finding yourself interacting with folks that you maybe have never interacted with before.
Every day. Half my calls are with people on topics that wouldn't be in my day job description, and with people that I have never met before but have also worked for the city for 20 years.
That's awesome. Okay, I'm going to administer our last poll and we'll just finish up our questions. And I think now is a good time to do our second poll about San Francisco's budget. And you'll see, I'm going to allow panelists to vote, so you can vote too, Ben. All right, while the poll is in progress, what is the city doing to digitally engage citizens with departmental services? Obviously, a lot of them are accessed through paper processes.
So sorry, I was busy voting no on this. Someone on the call needs to. There has been a lot of focus. There's a digital services team in the city administrator's office that's been working on kind of improving the city's the approach to kind of remote and digital work. The city is still very kind of paper and physical transaction driven, like a lot of governments are. So there had been some good work on that in the last couple of years. And I think obviously an event like this is going to drive that to occur much faster.
All right. Well, I would say that we're about to the end of the conversation. I would love to give you a couple minutes to close off with, speaking to everybody that's here. What would you like the call to action to be?
I think it really, I do think this is one of those moments where I don't know what comes out of this. I don't think any of us really do, but it's pretty clear that there's going to have to be some reimagining about how some of the pieces of civic life in the city fit together, how that how the business, how does the business community and parts of the business community change as a result of this? How does the workforce need to be supported here in the city differently, in both private and public during moments like this, and nonprofit? What's the role the government plays, and how does all of that change? And it's a set of kind of unknown but important conversations. So I think that my biggest ask of myself and all of us at the moment is just participating in all those discussions. We do tend to kind of lock ourselves into our usual corners of the world, and there's not as much collaboration or kind of visioning of where we want to be going. Whether, I'm in the business community, I'm in the nonprofit community, I'm a government employee. So I think finding forums to do that together is going to be important here, given these unknown times.
Yeah, and that's a big piece of why we're having the conversation today. That's why we check to see, what industries are represented here to make sure that we are that connecting piece. I would say for SF City's call to action, everyone make sure you are registered to vote. We want to make sure that we're voting down ballot. Always make sure that you are voting locally. The impact that you can have locally is huge. This is how we determine our city's leadership and who's going to be getting us through the storm. I think a lot of people maybe didn't know Mayor Breed's name and all of their supervisors, but they certainly do after this last month and a half. Okay, well, I will let you get back to saving the city, Ben. You're a busy guy. We need you. Thank you so much for joining us. To everybody that's on today, thank you for joining us for your lunch. A budget lecture and talk is not everybody's idea of a warm, sunny lunch, but we appreciate you engaging, and a copy of this will be sent out so that you can rewatch and get all those fun numbers that Ben listed. The 1.7 billion was our loss there.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks everyone. We will be back at you soon with another policy chat. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.